How to know if you have a drinking problem. This question is one that a lot of folks wrestle with when they feel like, their drinking habit might be taking on a more prevalent role in their life than they like. And occasionally this thought might bubble up. And you would think maybe it should be really easy to answer that question. If you have a drinking problem, it should be pretty obvious, right? But in reality, I suspect that because there is so much stigma tied to the notion of, a quote unquote problem with alcohol or problem with drinking, that a lot of us don't want to think about it. We don't want to contemplate whether or not, I've transitioned from just exuberant social drinking into problem territory. And, I think that the notion that if I say yes, that by definition means that I now, have to wear this label of alcoholic or alcoholism, and then therefore the most frequently prescribed solution set for that diagnosis, of course, most of us would assume is that you go to AA meetings, and no knock whatsoever on AA or their philosophy or their methods or the great folks who are a part of it, but I just feel like that is one solution, and for some reason, this particular problem, we've sort of designated a one-size-fits-all diagnosis and a one-size-fits-all solution. And so I think that steers a lot of people away from even wanting to contemplate whether they might have a problem with alcohol. So I'm going to tell you what I think the surefire way to guarantee you know whether you have a problem with alcohol or not, and it's really simple. If you're asking yourself the question, if you're asking the question, is it possible I have a problem with alcohol now? The answer is yes. That's my contention. I believe if you're asking the question, you have now crossed into problem territory. And the evidence that I use to back up this belief, from my point of view, is that if you're just a social drinker, and you probably know people like this, if you're someone who's a little higher on the alcohol drinker spectrum yourself, but let's say you know some folks who are, light drinkers, social drinkers, whatever you want to call them, folks who may partake every so often, or people for whom alcohol just isn't particularly important in their life. It's not something they do every day or even every week, maybe not even every month. Just something they do at special occasions or when they're out to dinner or out with friends or at a holiday or a barbecue, whatever. Point being, those people, their consumption level and the frequency of their consumption is so minute that they never ask themselves, do I have a problem with alcohol? They just don't, right? People who don't have a problem with alcohol, they don't, or people who don't overconsume it, they never really wonder if they do. And even if you, put one of those folks into a situation where maybe they go off the rails, they go overboard, maybe they go to Vegas for the weekend with some friends or whatever and try to keep up and end up drinking way more than normal and wake up with a bad hangover the next day. If that is the first time they've experienced something like that in many, many years, and probably the only time they'll experience it in many more years, they're just going to realize, okay, man, I overdid it, and then move on. Probably the way you might feel if you ate too much, pie or something, and then you had a stomach ache and felt gross afterwards. You're not going to think, oh man, I have an eating problem. You're just going to think, I ate too much pie. But it's sort of, if the frequency of these problematic episodes start to creep up into your life, and presumably if you're asking the question, do I have a problem with alcohol, there is obviously some reason you're asking that question. In my case, and in the case with a lot of the coaching clients that I work with, you begin to see a pattern, and it could be a pattern of behavioral episodes that you're regretful about, not thrilled with. You feel they're not representative of the kind of person you want to be. Or it could be just not sleeping well, restless sleep, waking up feeling gross, or with a full-on hangover. But there's some reason that folks ask themselves this question. And I, again, believe that if you are asking the question, the answer is yes. So, what does that mean? And what should you do about it? Well, again, a lot of folks would just assume that if you say yes to that, you're an alcoholic. Well, false. In fact, from a medical perspective, at least here in the US, there are multiple different designations associated with an alcohol problem. Alcohol use disorder has a couple of different categories. But even there, I think we all understand, and this is why I created the concept of what I call the alcohol drinker spectrum, just simply a way to kind of articulate the fact that there are folks who drink very little, there are folks who drink way too much, there are folks along the spectrum moving forward toward more consumption who may be psychologically addicted to alcohol, yet they have not crossed the threshold of physical addiction, which is a very different ballgame. So the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all diagnosis is false. Clearly, the evidence shows that. But secondarily, nor should the solution be one-size-fits-all. And for some strange reason, when it comes to this issue, we sort of feel like, well, that's just the thing that you're supposed to do is, join AA. And again, no knock on AA whatsoever. I know a lot of people have had success with it, but also a lot of people haven't. And I think that, in this day and age, for every conceivable problem you can think of, whether it would be a relationship problem or a financial problem or a fitness or health or weight problem, whatever you want to, problem you want to label, there's a multitude of potential solutions out there. There's programs and there's books and there's podcasts and there's YouTube channels and there's online communities and there's trainers and coaches and all sorts of consultants that can help you with, whatever degree of, this issue you're dealing with and help you get it solved. And thankfully, I think we're starting to see more and more on this topic of over drinking, a lot more resources out there for people to combat this, get their arms around it, put it in check, put it behind them, and go on to live a perfectly, alcohol-free, or at least alcohol problem-free life. And so with that said, that's how I see it. And, speaking of those types of resources, you can check out my website, sobermentum.com. Lots of free resources there, blogs and, podcast links and so on. But, the great news is you don't have to be shackled by this. And I would just encourage you, if you're asking this question, now is the time to take action. I sort of let years go by when, from the time I first wondered, do I have a problem with alcohol, until the time I finally executed my sober vacation, which I'm still on and have no plans of ever coming off of. But, I waited, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years of sort of trying to stop, taking breaks. I knew I had an issue. I just kept on going. And you don't need to do that. And it's something that can absolutely be in your rearview mirror if you're willing to commit to putting some focus on it. And again, lots of resources out there to explore this. So with that said, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And have a wonderful day. Catch you on the next episode.